Welcome back, class. We're going to pick up today in class. We did an activity that was looking at Europe and its process of renewal following World War II. And we know that the destruction, devastation, and even the transformed political landscape and the balance of power throughout the world that followed World War II were all sources of potential hardship for Europe. And so today in class you looked at steps and dynamics that existed within countries like France, Germany, Great Britain, various places within Eastern Europe, and sort of how their experience, some of the highlights of their experience in coming to grips with the new nature of Europe following World War II. And I wanted to take a little time so that I wouldn't have to take time in class tomorrow to talk just specifically about the experience of the former Yugoslavia, which is that part of southeastern Europe that, following the conclusion of the Cold War, it experienced unique turbulence. And I think one way of thinking about the experience of the former Yugoslavia, or the Balkans, is that, while the Cold War in many ways was an unfortunate source of tension, an unfortunate use of resources in the United States and the Soviet Union, you can imagine that there may have been higher purposes that both of their economies could have pursued with the trillions of dollars they spent on defense and nuclear weapons and things of that nature. But nonetheless, maybe one of the positive things of the Cold War, if you want to bend your mind just a little bit to think of things this way, is that it did extend and maintain a certain level of stability throughout much of the world. Most of the non-superpower regions of the world and peoples of the world were very cognizant of both the U.S. and Soviet power, and as a result, they kind of, they exhibited some stability. It wasn't Sometimes that stability came at the expense of justice, but nonetheless, the world order for much of the mid-20th century was surprisingly stable. And it was just a stability that was created by a sense of competition and neither of the main superpowers wanting to anger the other so much so that it would prompt an overwhelming response from either side. So these are our goals, our objectives for our brief time together today, and I want to look at Yugoslavia, and then we'll look briefly at the formation of Europe into a supranational region of the world. More on that in a bit. Okay, so Yugoslavia, which you know was uh, a, a state actor in the mid 20th century, it was essentially formed out of the instability and hardships following World War I, and it really emerged as a somewhat powerful, somewhat contributing presence to the world, particularly after World War II. And it was arranged under a powerful leader by the name of Josip Broz, who went by the name of Tito. And Tito was a source of controversy for a brief time at the beginning of the Cold War because the United States essentially overestimated the ties that bound Joseph Stalin and Tito. And so as a result, the United States feared that there was probably a greater common cause between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia than there actually ever existed. But Yugoslavia consisted of a number of different republics, a couple autonomous provinces, and so in some ways Yugoslavia was like a microcosm. It was a small-scale example of the Soviet Union as a whole, even right down to the ties that bound the various republics of this state actor together. But what really is remarkable, I mean, there's a couple things that are worthy of note here, and that is one, as long as Tito was around, he lived until I think he died in 1980, he exerted stability and a cohesive tension upon the various republics that he governed, and they were referred to as Yugoslavia, this coalition or union of various republics. But of course this begs the question, when Tito does die, and you can think of this in some ways as though when Stalin died, and suddenly the scary old uncle that kept everyone sort of on their best behavior and unwilling and too afraid to challenge the powers that be, a similar dynamic set in Yugoslavia. And so after the passing of Tito, we're going to start to see various republics trying to agitate for separation. They don't want to be a part of this, what has always been known as Yugoslavia. And that was for fairly good reason, because Serbia, which was the largest of these republics, and Serbia's borders essentially extended like this. There are a couple autonomous republics that were actually sort of a part of Serbia, Kosovo in the south being the main one, and then also up north here you see Vojvodina, and this is also an autonomous province. So what happens is Serbia has the greater interest, if you want to think of it that way, of holding this coalition, this Yugoslavia, together. The problem is Serbia was kind of like that bad, I guess, husband where, there's that union and you're together. I'm thinking husband and wife, but that union really exists to serve the interests and needs of the more powerful presence here, in this case Serbia. So when it seemed like it might be a good time to depart, and the 1990s was a great time for that because the Soviet Union had dissolved and change was in the air and everyone seemed to be looking for independence, that becomes the time when various republics within Yugoslavia start to agitate for independence. This starts with, it happens in a fairly predictable manner, starting with Slovenia and Croatia. Slovenia had very little trouble getting away because it was so far removed from Serbia. Serbia would have had to really reach pretty hard to keep Slovenia as part of it. Croatia had a little more of a difficult time because it was so close, and also because the leader of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, one of the true villains of the 20th century, Milosevic insisted that the parts of Croatia that had that had fairly large populations of Serbian people who were ethnically Serbian, that those parts of Croatia would have to be cordoned off and turned over and added to Serbia if Croatia in fact wanted independence. Now this created some hardship, and it created a war in the mid-1990s, and that war became so difficult, and the atrocities committed in it became so significant, including for a time in Bosnia, Milosevic, one of the true low points of that conflict happened at Srebrenica, and at Srebrenica several thousand people were put to death by the Serbian army, and this prompted an international response. Essentially what was happening is Slobodan Milosevic was practicing what we refer to as ethnic cleansing. He felt if he quote-unquote cleansed all of the people who lived in a part of Croatia or Bosnia, all the non-Serbian-like people, so if they were Muslims, which was often the case, he was trying to get rid of them, assuming that if you ethnically cleanse that area, it will be more easily added to Serbia. So this becomes really the cause for being for Serbia throughout the mid-90s. And finally, the United States and Europe send in a UN peacekeeping force to stop the violence and prevent any further ethnic cleansing from happening in this instance. And so a ceasefire agreement is signed in '95. Note that Slobodan Milosevic is still around. It's just a ceasefire. This is Slobodan Milosevic. In round two of the conflicts in the Balkans comes in the late 90s. And this time what has happened is Milosevic has gone into the autonomous province of Serbia. So Kosovo was an autonomous province within Serbia, meaning it was essentially a part of Serbia technically, but for 15 years or so it had been treated as a separate, ethnically different part of Serbia that had special rights to self-rule, and the Serbian government more or less respected those. Well, Milosevic decided it was time to end that practice. He wanted to be more forcefully in charge of all of Serbia. And so this was a further escalation of that conflict in the Balkans. The people of Kosovo formed the Kosovo Liberation Army, or the KLA, and they begin to fight. And the Serbs have the upper hand in this, as they are a much more sort of modernized and a better resourced force. So finally, once again, international community intervenes, and this time it's a NATO bombing. And shortly thereafter, Milosevic fails to win re-election in Serbia, and it's not long thereafter where he is apprehended and put on trial for crimes against humanity, his ethnic cleansing and genocide that he commits during the various conflicts in the former Yugoslavia throughout the 90s, and he'll die in 2006. So that was I think what's interesting about the Balkans is it's a case study in what happens when more or less stable or well understood balance of power exists, and then suddenly it's removed. And it's fair to say that a lot of the challenges that exist in the Balkans are the result of the people there trying to figure out what is going to be this new post-Soviet power arrangement. And of course it does not come without some really harsh and painful losses, particularly for the people of Bosnia and the people of Kosovo. Okay, so we move on. Another important development that's going on in Europe post-World War II is what we call the formation of a supranational arrangement. And a supranational, or I should say the phenomenon of supranationalism, refers to when various countries come together to pursue shared interests. And it's sort of the idea that in numbers there is strength. And if you can think about this historically, we know that Europe throughout the 18th and 19th centuries had held a commanding presence on the global stage. They had been the most powerful economically, militarily, culturally, religiously, you name it. And of course, there was no doubting or no mistaking the fact that following World War II, European countries were no longer the engine of global change. And for many Europeans, this came as a very rude surprise, very rude awakening. You read in your activity today, you were looking at some of the challenges that these various European countries faced. Well, one solution that Europeans start to work on, and European leadership, is that if we can work together economically, if we can join our, if we can make Europe, sometimes you'll hear the phrase fortress Europe, make it like a single region with borders that are porous, where tariffs and taxes won't be applied across borders, where maybe a common currency can be utilized. The idea was that we can essentially offset our losses in power relative to the United States and the Soviet Union. So starting, building on the model of NATO, which the United States is a part of, but, essentially an international or supranational body that was aimed at helping Western Europe and the United States essentially counter challenges brought about by communism and its expansion. Drawing upon perhaps that example, Europeans start to form larger and larger blocks. And starting in 1957 and building all the way to 1994, various countries are added to what becomes known as the European Union. And it was, again, an economic union that would result in cheaper, easier, more beneficial trade relations that would put the people and the countries of Europe on a greater par with their world power rivals. I won't say rivals, but rivals for power anyway, the United States and the Soviet Union. And this becomes an economic monetary union. It's still in effect today, and I'll just close by saying that various times the European Union has had fantastic success. So a student in class just yesterday was talking about the value of the euro relative to the dollar, and now that's starting to change and the dollar is strengthening against the euro, but this has been successful. More tomorrow. Bye.